Day 1. It was a warm late spring morning when Jake Jackson turned his car off the hard road and onto an old dirt road which led back into the mountains of rural West Virginia. The sun was out in a cloudless light blue sky. The air was fresh, the trees were in full bloom, and the birds were chirping. The narrow single-lane dirt road wound its way up and down hills and contained many blind curves which must be approached with caution. It contained deep ruts and holes he had to watch for unless he wanted to bottom his car out and destroy its exhaust system. The road was nothing more than a dirt pathway carved out of the mountainside. It hugged the mountain on the right and dropped 50 feet into a river on the left. The rule of the road was the larger vehicle had the right-of-way. This meant an oncoming vehicle which was larger than Jake's required him to back up to a spot in the road wide enough to allow the larger vehicle to pass. Jake drove a newer Pontiac Grand Am, so he had to watch for oncoming trucks and four-wheel drives and pay close attention to the road surface. He daydreamed while he listened to Duran Duran's hit song, The Reflex, on his car's stereo cassette deck while he made his way down the old treacherous road. His destination was 4 miles ahead, where he would ford the river on his way to his late great-grandparents' farm. His destination was Wildcat. Wildcat was centrally located in the wonderful state of West Virginia, within the county of Lewis. It was located along the Little Kanawha River and County Route 50. It sat 20 miles southeast of the nearest town of Weston. Since Jake's grandparents had passed on, the current population of Wildcat was 5 people. This was what the weathered Wildcat population sign said. The time-worn sign sat on the right shoulder of Route 50, a short distance before his turnoff. Of these 5 people, he knew 2 of Wildcat's inhabitants were seasonal part-time residents. The part-timers owned a large house, also known as a summer retreat, a short distance up the road from his grandparents' farm. The only full-time resident Jake was aware of was Miss Bernadine. She was Wildcat's postmistress and lived in a house next to the small post office. The post office sat along the hard road to the left just beyond where he turned onto the old dirt road. The population sign made Jake wonder who Wildcat's other 2 inhabitants were. The 50-acre farm lay in a small valley nestled between several heavily forested mountains. The upper back fork of the Little Kanawha River flowed through the middle of the farm. The farm itself consisted of a small, modest single-story farmhouse, several outbuildings, and a barnyard complete with an old outhouse. Jake remembered he would enter the property through an old car gate and into what was aptly called the car lot. 3 outbuildings stood to the left along the top of the riverbank inside the car lot. The first outbuilding was a red rustic tool shed. It housed many of Jake's grandpa's old tree saws, axes, and various other antique hand tools and woodworking equipment. The second building was the coal house. It served to store coal used to heat the farmhouse. His grandpa had used coal to heat the house during the winter with a centrally located coal stove in the living room. The third building was the wash house. It contained an extra bed for guests as well as an old wringer washer his grandma had used to do their laundry. The wash house also contained an old wood cook stove his grandma had used throughout the summer months so she wouldn't heat up the farmhouse when the temperatures rose outside. An air conditioner was a luxury his grandparents could not afford. Across the driveway from the outbuildings to the right stood Jake's grandpa's old chopping block and woodpile. The woodpile was comprised of 6 cords of chopped wood. Each cord was stacked neatly into 4 feet tall by 8 feet long rows and covered with tin roof panels. The roof panels protected the seasoned firewood. To the right of the woodpile stood an old wooden utility pole. A security light was affixed to the top of the pole. The security light had been used to light up the night when his grandparents had lived there. Since their passing, the farm was visited sporadically, so the electric had been shut off. With no electric, the area was left in a blanket of perpetual and absolute darkness at night. The driveway turned into a narrow lane past the wash house. The lane continued beyond the front of the house and stopped at the barnyard fence. The lane sat atop the steep riverbank. The river flowed in its bed about 15 feet below it. The riverbank had been significantly widened in this area due to the many years Jake's grandpa had thrown ashes from the coal and wood cook stoves over the side of it. The old farmhouse stood ahead on the right and was surrounded by a 5 feet high wire cattle fence. The purpose of the fence was to keep the dog in the yard and the farm animals and varmints out of it. An old wooden gate stood in the middle of the fence. A well-worn path led from the gate through the yard into the front porch. The farmhouse itself was modest. At one time, it contained only an eat-in kitchen, a living room, and 1 small bedroom. Jake remembered how his grandpa had told him how he had moved the small three-room house from a location farther up and from the other side of the river in the 1930s. He had moved it with the help of a few of his friends and neighbors. They had moved it down a 1.5-mile-long dirt path which had been cut through the woods along both sides of the river. They had rolled it over the tops of several logs they had to pick up and move along the way. A team of horses had been hitched to the house, and the horses had to pull it across the tops of logs and to its current location. Jake's grandpa had added a second bedroom to the original house a couple years after he had moved it. The second bedroom had become his grandparents' master bedroom. When his grandpa had built it, he had built it off the front side of the house on the end opposite the kitchen, near the barnyard. The house had become L-shaped with the addition of the bedroom. After the bedroom was added, his grandpa had built a large covered front porch to fill the void between the new room and the other end of the house. This turned the house into the overall shape of a rectangle. A food cellar packed full with all the food his grandma had canned over many years before she had passed away sat to the right and behind the house. The cellar contained anything anyone would want. It was still stocked with mason jars full of food from floor to ceiling and from front to back. It also contained old vegetable bins for potatoes, onions, and other fresh vegetables his grandparents had kept on hand during the harvest season. The bins now sat empty. Jake's grandparents had led a hard but simple life. Neither of them had ever owned an automobile nor possessed a driver license. They lived off the land and had raised beautiful gardens for vegetables and farm animals for meat. In their younger years, his grandpa had worked as a lumberjack and his grandma worked as a cook in the lumberjack camps. They had traveled all over the countryside and worked together to clear land and build various state parks. They had also developed other housing and recreational areas as the population grew within central West Virginia. If they needed supplies, Jake's grandpa hitched the horse up to an old handmade wooden wagon and traveled several miles into the mountains to a little country store. If he couldn't find what he needed, he asked a neighbor who lived in the next county for a ride into town. The neighbor lived about 4 miles away at the top of the mountain, which rose from the valley floor behind his grandparents' farm. Beyond the house on the other side of the wire cattle fence lays the barnyard. Jake remembered when he faced the front porch and walked left through the front yard and around the far end of the house, he would come upon an old barnyard gate. If he passed through the gate, an old smokehouse stood to the right. Jake's grandpa had used the smokehouse to smoke and store meats. He had also used it to preserve and store other meats like bear, elk, squirrel, deer, and fish with salt. Beyond the smokehouse and to the right stood the cornhouse, where field corn was converted into animal feed and was put up for safekeeping. The cornhouse was also used to store various items in its loft Jake's grandparents didn't use often. It housed things Jake considered antique as well as other things which had outlived their usefulness. Jake's grandpa had also used the cornhouse to dry and store homegrown chewing tobacco. He would attach the tobacco to long braids of rope and hang the braids from the rafters. His grandpa had grown his tobacco in a large patch outside the vegetable garden because his grandma didn't want it to grow alongside her vegetables. On the off chance the tobacco crops didn't produce, his grandpa would buy several pouches of Redman or Levi Garrett when he ventured into town. This didn't happen often because his tobacco crops prospered like their vegetable gardens always did. Beneath the old cornhouse was an old chicken coop Jake's grandpa didn't use and had never boarded up. As a child, Jake remembered how he used to hate to climb into and back out of the cornhouse. He was convinced a monster lived underneath it and would grab him by the legs. Even as an adult, that was one fear that has always stuck with him. Just beyond the cornhouse and to the right stood several small breeding houses Jake's grandpa had. Used to breed chickens and to raise baby chicks. His grandpa would put a laying hen inside one of the houses and wait for her to lay her fertilized eggs. The hen would sit on her eggs until the eggs hatched. His grandpa would turn the hen and chicks loose back out into the barnyard with the rest of the chickens when the eggs hatched. Half the chickens were bred for meat while the other half were bred for eggs. In the middle of the barnyard stood a beautiful, 70 feet tall Monterey pine tree he had to walk under to get to the outhouse. The outhouse stood alongside the riverbank on the other side of the barnyard along a path which led to the new chicken coop and the pig pen. The outhouse was a simple one-seater Jake remembered having to help his grandpa move one time as a boy. The reason they had to move it was because the hole had reached its limit and began to overflow. Where it had originally sat, the outhouse stunk to high heaven, but he would eventually get used to the smell. On the right inside wall of the outhouse hung a wooden toilet paper holder which held a single roll of toilet paper along with 6 dried corn cobs. The corn cobs were located behind a small piece of glass affixed to a wooden frame. The main toilet paper holder had a small hammer which hung off of it by a small chain. Printed in big, bold black letters on the main toilet paper holder above the corn cobs was a notice which read, "In case of emergency, break glass." Jake's grandma had always kept toilet paper well stocked inside the outhouse. She had usually kept several rolls atop a ventilation shaft which ran across the back wall of it. For this, Jake was thankful. He wouldn't have wanted to break the glass unless he absolutely had to. The chicken coop stood about 30 feet past the outhouse. The inside of the chicken coop contained a wide ladder-like structure Jake's grandpa had built out of small tree branches for the chickens to roost on. It also contained several wooden laying bins his grandpa had built out of old boards for the chickens to deposit their eggs. Jake remembered as a boy he had to open the door to the chicken coop early in the morning to let the chickens out. After the chickens came back home to roost in the evening, he had to walk back out to the barnyard and close the door to keep predators out. It was also his responsibility to feed the chickens and gather their eggs twice a day. Jake's grandparents had raised and kept various different breeds of 50 to 60 free-roaming hens and a couple roosters at any given time. The breeds they had raised included barred Plymouth Rock, Leghorn, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island Reds. The majority of the chickens and roosters were gentle and docile, but many were nervous when around humans and wouldn't let Jake pet them. Jake remembered one time as a small boy when he and his parents visited and his grandpa had gotten a new white Wyandotte rooster. Jake walked into the barnyard and the new rooster let him walk up to it and kneel down and pet it. When he stood and turned to walk away, the rooster attacked him and dug its spurs into the backs of his legs. He remembered he had worn shorts, and when the rooster dug its spurs into him, it felt like the backs of his legs were jabbed with long, sharp needles. He remembered he had been able to fight the rooster off himself and get back to safety on the other side of the fence. His grandpa had witnessed the event and stood there and laughed. The Wyandotte rooster would chase and attack anyone who casually walked through the barnyard except for Jake's grandpa, it seemed. One day, a year or two later, the rooster had sneaked up on his grandpa and attacked him when he got something from out of the barn. Needless to say, his grandpa didn't find it very funny. Having the last laugh, his grandpa had decided he would eat the rooster for supper that evening and wrung its neck. He remembered his grandpa said something to the effect of how the rooster was a tough old bird while they ate him that night for dinner. Several yards beyond the chicken coop stood the pig pen. The pig pen was designed to include both a stable where the pigs ate and slept along with an outside fenced-in area where they would go to the bathroom and wallow around in the mud. The stable part of the structure had a front opening covered by a horizontal shutter. The shutter was made from 3 boards which were joined together with cross braces. The shutter was attached to the stable with top-mounted hinges so it could be lifted up and propped open. Jake's grandpa had designed and built the stable in this manner so he could pour slop through the opening and into a trough inside the stable. A door stood on the right wall of the stable which opened outward into a 20 feet by 30 feet pen. The door was open during the daytime to allow the pigs to come and go into the pen as they pleased. At night, the door was closed after the pigs went back inside the stable to sleep. In the early springtime of every year, Jake's grandpa would walk to a different neighbor's farm who lived several miles away across the river. He would do this to visit the neighbor and to buy 1 or 2 little pink piglets. His grandpa would carry the piglets home inside a burlap sack he had flung over his back. He would turn the piglets loose inside the stable and feed them twice a day for a couple months, until they were big enough to be let out into the pen. During this time, his grandpa had warned Jake not to become friendly or get attached to the pigs because of what would happen to them in the fall. Over the course of the summer, Jake's grandpa fed and fattened the pigs and raised them into giant hogs for the upcoming butcher season. Butcher season took place in late October or early November. During this time, his grandpa butchered the hogs and his grandma turned the meat into ham, bacon, sausage, and other cuts of pork. His grandpa smoked the majority of the meats while his grandma prepared and canned a lot of it. The main structure in any barnyard was the barn. On this farm, a large barn stood centrally located in the middle of the barnyard beyond all of the other buildings aforementioned. The right side of the barn contained 4 stalls. 2 stalls in the front used for horses and 2 in the back used for cows. The middle section of the barn was nothing more than a large storage room and hay loft. Jake's grandpa had kept the horse saddles and other horse tack, along with various tools, straw, and animal feed in this section of the barn. He had also kept a mother cat and a few of her kittens in this section of the barn along with a black snake or 2 to keep the mice under control. An empty storage bay which housed various farm equipment was located on the far left side of the barn. This bay at one time contained an old Pinecrest green and white 1956 Chevy Bel Air Jake's father had parked there prior to Jake's birth. His father had sold the old dilapidated car for $300 to someone who had purchased it and then had to move it from the storage bay on a flatbed tow trailer when Jake was in his early teens. Barney was the name of Jake's grandpa's horse. Barney was a brown and white pinto. His grandpa had used Barney to manually plow the garden in the 10-acre cornfield each year. He had also used Barney to pull felled timbers from the woods for firewood. His grandpa would keep Barney at the farm to work him throughout the spring and fall months and put him out to pasture during the summer and winter months. Jake remembered Barney was like an oversized dog and would run to him when he whistled for him. There had been numerous times where Jake had put the bridle on Barney and led him around to the back of the barn to an old woodpile. He would climb upon the woodpile so he could get on Barney's back and ride him bareback. Barney was always gentle and Jake looked forward to playing with him every time he visited. One of the first photographs taken of Jake was when he was a year old. It was a picture of him as he sat on Barney's back while his mother held on to him and propped him up so he wouldn't fall off. Jake remembered his grandparents only ever having had one milk cow named Sugar from when he was a little boy. Sugar's name was given to her because she supposedly produced sweet milk. His grandfather had sold her when Jake was fairly young. Jake doesn't remember too much about her other than how his grandpa had taught him how to milk her. One off memory Jake had of Sugar was from when he was maybe 3 or 4 years old. He had gathered the eggs from the chickens. He was excited because he collected the eggs by himself and ran through the barnyard back to the house. He didn't see a huge cow patty which sat in the middle of the path, and he slipped and fell and slid completely through it. He remembered how he was covered from head to toe in runny cow dung. He also remembered how he broke all the eggs and how his mother took him to the river to clean him up before she and his grandma would let him back into the house. Beyond the barn and back in the woods to the left sat a large garbage dump located on the other side of an old barbed wire fence. This was the location where Jake's grandparents had thrown all the stuff they couldn't burn. The garbage pile contained things like old bottles, tin cans, and other similar items. It is in this location where Jake would sometimes play because he never knew what he might find while he dug through the garbage. The garbage dump sat in a creepy location. Jake considered it creepy because of the large pine trees which surrounded it. The pine trees cast dark shadows and didn't allow much sunlight to shine through to the forest floor. In another location behind the barn back in the woods and to the right was a shallow, slow-moving offshoot of the river. Jake used to occasionally play in this location and build dams and float his toy boats in the water. Jake thought this area was also creepy because it butted up against the hillside which contained several large and dense laurel thickets he couldn't see into. This area was somewhat like the area which surrounded the garbage dump because the tree canopy was also thick and didn't allow much sunlight to shine through. Jake usually played in this area by himself, and he would often get the feeling of someone or something as it watched him from within the dense thickets. After a while, he would get scared and go back to the house if the feeling became too intense. Once Jake finished daydreaming, he ejected the cassette tape and shut off the radio and looked over to his buddy Steve, who was asleep in the passenger seat, and said, "We're almost to the spot where we'll ford the river. It's on the left just around the next curve," while he tapped him on his left shoulder to wake him. Steve sat upright in his seat and yawned and stretched. "Good. I'm tired of riding." "Why'd you shut the radio off?" "That's one of my favorite songs." "I'm tired of listening to it," Jake said as he gunned the engine. "Besides, we're almost there." The ford was located in the main part of the Little Kanawha River. The upper fork of the river ran through the farm and emptied into the main river near the ford. The location where the upper fork met the main part of the river was about 100 yards to the left of the ford. They rounded the curve and pulled up to the river. They got out of the car and stood on the riverbank. "There's no way we're going to be able to cross the river," Steve said as he skipped a small flat stone across it. "The water's too deep and it's moving too fast." "No shit, Sherlock. I suppose that's because of the late snow runoff or from previous rainstorms, or both. Since we can't ford it, we're going to have to turn the car around and move up to the top of the hill to park and cross the swinging bridge. We'll either have to do that or drive back out to the hard road and then drive in another 50 miles through the mountains to come out on the other side of the river. If we do that, we'll end up on the road which comes down through the mountains behind the house." Steve sighed and got back into the car, parked the car, and let's cross the bridge. Jake got back into the car and turned it around and drove farther up the hill and pulled up and parked just beyond the opening to the swinging bridge which sat to their left. The swinging bridge was installed by the state of West Virginia in the 1950s as a way for Jake's grandparents and the part-time residents of the retreat to get across the river to get their mail. Their mailboxes were posted on this side of the river and sat to the right of the bridge opening. The bridge was constructed using 2 steel cables that rose up and over 2 steel support arches. The cables were anchored into the ground on either side of the river. The steel anchors were connected to turnbuckles which held the tension in the cables. The walkway of the bridge was made of wooden planks which were attached to wooden support beams. The beams were secured by steel rods which hung from the cables. The rods were spread evenly along the cables about every 4 feet. Even though the bridge was considered state property, it was Jake's grandpa who had always maintained it. Since his passing, it had deteriorated rather quickly. His grandpa had always kept the steel parts of the bridge painted. They rusted because of the constant damp air which came from the river. The middle of the bridge sagged considerably. Most of the wooden planks which make up the main walkway also appeared rotten. The bridge appeared to have barely survived the test of time. The bridge was about 75 feet long and was suspended about 40 feet above the surface of the river. When you walked across the bridge, it bounced up and down and swayed back and forth. It was difficult to traverse when you couldn't hold onto the cables when your arms were full of supplies. After Jake parked his car, and while he and Steve got back out, Jake said, "We'll have to walk and carry everything from the car to the house, which is about a half-mile away. We're gonna have to make multiple trips." Steve walked over to the bridge and examined it and asked, "We have to cross that old thing? Do you think it's safe?" "It should be safe enough to cross," Jake said as he walked to the back of the car and opened the trunk. Jake started to load up on supplies they brought from home. He looked over at Steve, who lightly jumped up and down on the bridge and shouted, "Get your ass over here and help me load up so we can carry this stuff to the house. You can get the groceries." With his arms folded in front of him, Steve walked back over to the car. "There's no way we're gonna be able to carry all this shit to the house." Jake looked over the top of the trunk lid with his eyes narrowed and his brows lowered. Steve unfolded his arms and reached into the back seat and got the 10 bags of groceries they had just picked in Weston on their way to the farm. In the trunk, they each had one large duffel bag full of clothes and other personal items. They had 2 coolers, one loaded with ice and perishable foods, the other loaded with ice, milk, juice, and soda. They brought 4 cases of bottled water to drink and cook with. They also brought a 2-burner propane camp stove, a large metal coffee pot, 2 cast iron frying pans for fishing poles, 2 tackle boxes, and 2 fully collapsible sling chairs to sit in when they fished. To get all of their supplies from the car to the house would definitely require more than one trip. They loaded up with as much as they could safely carry across the bridge and made their way to the house. They knew they would have to do this at least 2 more times. While they walked down the road on the other side of the river toward the farm, Jake noticed no vehicles sat at the retreat when they passed by. He said, "We're here by ourselves." Steve said, "Good, at least it'll be quiet," as he nearly dropped a couple bags of groceries. The road surface along the way to the farm was damp, and the wetness compressed the sand and made for much easier walking. When they rounded a curve in the road, Jake noticed where it looked like something had been dragged across it. They stopped to examine the impressions and commented on how fresh they looked. The impressions were 2 parallel lines about a foot apart and were at least a couple inches deep in the wet sand. They completely crossed the road from left to right. That meant whatever had made them came up over the riverbank and crossed the road and the barbed wire fence which surrounded the old garden. They didn't notice any footprints or animal prints in the immediate area, so they wrote it off as nothing and continued onto the farm. When they reached the car gate, Jake had to put what he carried down to retrieve his keys from out of his pocket so he could unlock and open the gate. It was kept locked to keep would-be trespassers out. Keeping the gate locked wouldn't do much good because all one would need to get in is a pair of bolt cutters to cut the padlock off the chain or just climb over the top of the gate itself. After Jake opened the gate, he picked everything back up and continued to the house. Steve complained, "Man, it's a long way from the car to the house. Everything's getting heavy and I'm getting tired. When we make it to the house and get it unlocked and deposit our first load, we can take a short breather before we go back for the second one." "Good. I need to rest for a bit," Steve said. Jake said, "Yeah, so do I," as he unlocked and opened the front door. They stepped inside and set everything on the kitchen table, then stepped back out to the front porch to sit and rest. It's nice to be away from the city and to breathe in the fresh air and take in the new scenery, Steve said as he plopped his butt on the porch swing and opened a soda. Jake sat on the bench opposite Steve and said, "Yeah, it is." They decided to make this a 2-week-long fishing trip and vacation away from each of their jobs and families. They had planned this excursion since before they graduated from high school over a year ago. They decided it was just as good a time as any to get away. They felt it would be the perfect time before the weather got too warm to enjoy themselves during the hot and humid summer months. Jake stood and lit a cigarette. He walked to the backside of the house to take a leak. On his way past the end of the house, he noticed several large impressions in the tall grass which resembled footprints. He shouted to Steve, "Come take a look at what I found." The would-be footprints looked as if they crossed the yard from left to right. When they followed the prints, they noticed how they stopped near the back corner of the house where the house butted up against the hillside. They examined the house and noticed how an approximate 1-foot square piece of asphalt siding had been peeled off the gable end. The wooden clapboards underneath the siding had been exposed. The area where the siding was gone was nearly 9 feet off of the ground. Upon closer inspection, the edges of the siding around the bald area were smashed flat against the clapboards underneath it. Steve discovered a large oak branch which measured 2.5 feet long and approximately 4 inches in diameter as it stuck out of the ground underneath the exposed clapboards. Steve struggled to pull the branch out of the ground because the other end of it was driven 2 feet deep into the dirt. Jake thought when Steve discovered the branch it was odd because the only oak trees he was aware of which were close to the house were behind the barn. The trees nearest the house were primarily pitch pine, aspen, and white ash. He also thought this branch had to intentionally be placed there because it couldn't have fallen from out of the sky. When they further examined the branch, Jake discovered the part which was driven into the ground was somewhat flattened and its end appeared splintered around its edges. Jake said, "Someone's been beating on the end of the house with this tree branch." Steve asked, "Why would someone do that, especially since we're in the middle of nowhere?" as he continued to assess the damage. "I don't know, and it doesn't make any sense," Jake said. "If someone would have wanted to get into the house, all they'd have to do is cut the padlock off the front door or break a window. This tree branch and the missing siding is like the drag marks across the road, another mystery." Jake tossed the oak branch into the weeds on the hillside behind the house. Steve walked back around to the porch while Jake continued to stand there and skin the barnyard and water the fence post. He noticed nothing else looked out of place, so he finished his business and went to join Steve back on the porch. They continued to rest for a few more minutes before they made their second trip to and from the car. By the end of their third trip, Jake noticed it had taken approximately another hour and a half before they got the car fully unloaded and everything back to the house. Steve sat and rested on the porch while Jake put everything away. While he put everything away, he discovered he forgot to purchase batteries for the flashlights. Their only alternative for that evening was to find some lanterns and kerosene, which should be located in the wash house. After Jake put everything away, he stepped back out onto the porch. "I forgot to tell you we don't have any electricity. We hardly visit the farm anymore, so we had it disconnected. I also forgot to get batteries for the flashlights. I don't like the idea of being here without electricity," Steve said. His eyes widened as he stood. "How in the hell are we going to see without flashlights?" "My grandparents survived here for nearly 40 years without electricity," Jake said. "They didn't get it installed until the mid-1960s. We'll have to use lanterns until we can get back to town in a couple days to pick up more ice and get some batteries. I still don't like the idea of not having electricity," Steve said as he sat. "I'm afraid of the dark. I can sympathize with you because it's completely dark outside here at night. It's so dark, in fact, you can't see your hand in front of your face unless the moon's out." Jake took his keys and walked to the wash house to unlock it and look around for a couple of old weathered lanterns and some kerosene. He was lucky because he found a half-gallon of kerosene in it. Old rusted gas can his grandfather had written a big letter K on the side of. He carried everything back to the house and handed it to Steve and said, "When you finish getting the lanterns ready, I want to show you the rest of the house and where to put your clothes and get settled." Jake sat on the porch and smoked a cigarette while Steve filled the lanterns and got them ready for later on that evening. When Steve had prepped the lanterns, they stepped back into the house so Jake could show Steve around. Jake began Steve's tour in the kitchen. When you enter through the front door, you enter directly into the kitchen itself. An old sink sat just inside the kitchen to the right of the door up against the wall. Beside the sink and to the left was a window which overlooked the porch. Just beyond the window sat an old wood-cook stove which was positioned diagonally in the front left corner of the room between the window and the adjoining wall. Next to the stove and underneath a side window which faced the cellar sat a large wooden box which was used to store firewood. Next to the firewood box sat his grandma's old flower box. The flower box sat in front of another wooden box where his grandma stored her pots and pans. To the left of this box sat a china cabinet which contained his grandma's good china and other antique kitchen relics. On the back wall of the kitchen to the right of another window which faced the backyard sat another smaller china cabinet which housed all of his grandma's everyday dishes and silverware. On the adjacent left and side wall sat an old refrigerator, and to the left of it was a doorway which led into the living room. The kitchen table and chairs sat in the middle of the room. 2 extra chairs along with the leaf for the table sat in the corner between the refrigerator and back window. When you enter into the living room, an armchair sat just inside the room to the right up against the inside wall behind the refrigerator. A tall antique claw-footed oak end table sat in the corner. Next to the table on the back wall sat a couch and another armchair which sat underneath a window which also faced the backyard. Next to the chair sat another end table which matched the one in the opposite corner. On the adjoining wall of the living room opposite the kitchen sat an antique, bubble screen, black and white Zenith television. To the left of the television was a doorway which led into the guest room. Jake pointed the guest room out to Steve, and Steve took a quick look inside it, and they continued on. On the left side of the doorway sat an antique dresser with a tall oval-shaped bevel glass mirror which sat on top of it. On the next adjoining wall was a doorway which led into the master bedroom. To the left of the doorway sat a large old coal bucket and various tools which were used to clean out the coal stove. Located in the next corner of the living room beyond the coal stove was a front window which overlooked the porch. Beside this window on the back side of the kitchen wall sat another couch. The old coal stove sat in the middle of the living room floor. On opposite sides of the coal stove sat his grandparents' antique wooden rocking chairs. Steve continued to look around. What do we do if we have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night? They stood in the guest bedroom, so Jake pulled the chamber pot out from underneath the bed and handed it to Steve. "You've got to be kidding," he said as he removed the lid from the chamber pot and looked inside it. Steve handed the chamber pot back to Jake, and Jake slid it underneath the bed. "No, I'm not kidding. This is the way it's been done for centuries. The only other alternative is to use the outhouse out in the barnyard. In the dark, I'll use the chamber pot." They laughed. Jake got Steve set up in the guest room, which was nothing more than the bedroom located at the far end of the house near the barnyard gate, which stood about 50 feet from the bedroom window. The guest room contained 2 double-sized antique brass beds which were separated by an antique dry sink which sat underneath the window. The window was located in the middle of the room and faced the barnyard. The heads of each bed were located on either side of the window. Jake said, "Choose one of the 2 beds and put your duffel bag and clothes on the other one." Steve chose the bed on the left with the chamber pot underneath it. Jake pointed to a sliding window screen, which rested on its end between the right side of the dry sink and the bed on the right. "Open the window and put the screen in it to help air the house out." Jake next showed Steve where he could find a set of sheets, a couple pillowcases, and a blanket in the old dresser which sat in the living room so he could make his bed. While they stood in front of the dresser, Jake took a set of linens so he could make up his bed. Jake carried his duffel bag and linens into his grandparents' master bedroom to get himself situated. That room had 3 windows. It had a window on either side of the room and another one located in the middle. The window on the left faced toward the front yard. The window on the right faced the barnyard. The middle window faced the lane. Another double-sized antique brass bed sat in the middle of the bedroom with the foot of the bed pressed up against the middle window. A single bed sat in the inside corner of the room, along with a couple of dressers which sat against the outside walls on either side of the double bed. His grandma's old treadle Singer sewing machine sat against the foot of the single bed, and his grandpa's old gun rack hung on the wall above it. The gun rack was devoid of any guns and ammunition for fear someone might break into the house and steal them. Before he went to the kitchen, Jake made his bed and placed sliding window screens into each window on either side of his bed. This was done to allow a cross breeze and to air out the musty room. On his way into the kitchen, Jake noticed by his watch it approached 5:30 p.m. He shouted through the open doorway, "Well, what'd you like for dinner?" They discussed their options and thought them over. They agreed because they were both tired from the trip and because they had to carry everything from the car to the house. They would eat a light dinner. Their dinner consisted of a lunch meat sandwich and some potato chips. This was a good alternative to setting up the propane stove to heat up something different. After dinner, Jake asked, "Would you like a quick tour of the barnyard?" "That'd be cool," Steve said. After they threw their paper plates away and cleaned up the kitchen, they headed to the barnyard to explore. On their way to the barnyard, Jake picked up his cigarettes and lighter from off the bench on the front porch and led Steve around to the side of the house and to the barnyard gate. Jake showed Steve how to work the latch on the gate, and Steve opened it, and they stepped through it. Jake explained to Steve what each building was and the purpose each served when his grandparents still lived. Jake showed Steve the outhouse and checked to see if any toilet paper was still inside it. There wasn't any toilet paper, so he had to remember to set a couple rolls out on the porch. Jake said, "Depending who uses the outhouse first, seeing the rolls of toilet paper on the porch should remind one of us to bring them with us when we need to use the facilities. It would suck to come all the way out here to do your business and not have anything to wipe with," Steve said. Jake showed Steve the toilet paper holder in the outhouse, and Steve laughed and said, "That's funny. The first time you have to use dried corn cobs to wipe your ass, you won't be laughing," Jake said and smiled. "On the off chance you have to use the corn cobs to wipe in an emergency, you'll never forget to bring a roll of toilet paper out here with you ever again. Those suckers hurt." Steve chuckled and said, "I imagine they would." It was just starting to get dark, and Jake said, "I want to walk up behind the barn to the fence line, and then we can head to the house." They walked along while they looked at the property and made small talk along the way. Steve asked questions about Jake's grandparents, and Jake tried his best to answer them. It wasn't long before they found themselves back on the front porch. Jake said, "Because it's almost completely dark, we need to go ahead and light just one lantern. We need to save the other one so we won't run out of kerosene before we go back to town and get some more." Steve went into the house and brought one of the lanterns outside and lit it with a kitchen match from a ceramic matchbox which sat on the counter next to the cook stove. They continued to sit on the front porch and talked and listened to the river and planned their activities for the next day. Jake said, "After a good night's sleep, we can start the day off and go fishing. I know of a great fishing hole on the other side of the fence behind the barn. There's a place back in there where bass, trout, and catfish are plentiful. I fished there many times and never came back empty-handed. That'll be a good place to start, and I'm looking forward to it," Steve said as he swung on the porch swing. Jake looked at his watch, and it told him it was pushing 10 p.m. "I'm tired, and I'm gonna turn in. I want to get a good night's sleep, especially if we're gonna fish first thing in the morning," Steve said. "I'm also tired, and I guess I'm ready to turn in too." They headed off to their respective bedrooms to bed down for the night. Jake closed but didn't lock the front door before he headed off to bed. On his way to bed, he said, "I'll leave the lantern and a few matches sit on top of the coal stove in the living room if you need it during the night." Steve didn't say anything, so Jake assumed Steve either didn't hear him or had already fallen asleep. Jake put the lantern out and felt his way into his bedroom and went to bed. It took about 7 hours to make the trip from Northeast Ohio to the farm, and Jake was tired because he drove the whole way. Not to mention he was tired because they had to carry everything from the car to the house. He drifted off to sleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. Please tune in next week as we continue on with the next installment of A Journey Through Hell and Back. For those who cannot wait, this title is available on Amazon.com. A link to the book is available in the description below the video. Please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on the continuing saga.